Chapter 19, the First World War. Although many Americans wanted to stay out of the war, several factors are going to make American neutrality very difficult to maintain. As an industrial and imperial power, the United States felt many of the same pressures that led the nations of Europe into devastating war. Historians generally cite four long-term causes of the First World War, and those are four causes are what we're going to be focusing on in today's lesson. So we're going to identify, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to identify the long-term causes and the immediate circumstances that actually led to World War I. So let's take a look at those causes of World War I. Throughout the 19th century, understand that politics in the Western world were deeply influenced by this concept of nationalism. Nationalism, of course, is a devotion to the interest and culture of one's nation. And again, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but when it gets to an extreme, it can cause some problems. Very often, nationalism, as the first point mentions, will lead to competitive and antagonistic rivalries among nations. And in this atmosphere of competition, many European nations began to fear Germany's growing power in Europe. In addition to that, various ethnic groups really resented domination by other nations and really longed for their nations to become independent. Many ethnic groups also looked to larger nations to kind of help them and protect them. And in Russia, being that, if you look on the map, being that very large nation, really considered themselves the protector of all those little Slavic nations. If you kind of take a look at and see Austria-Hungary and look at like a lot of those arrows, those are some of those Slavic nations in there, as are some of them to the south of Austria-Hungary as well. That was kind of known as Pan-Slavism. All right. An important part here is to also take a look and see the little area of Serbia below Austria-Hungary there. And so this idea of Russia's Pan-Slavism also included Serbia, which was an independent nation, but many of the Serbs lived under the rule of Austria-Hungary. And specifically, if you take a look at just north of the green part on the map there, you see the city of Sarajevo. That was a part of Serbia that was under Austria-Hungary's rule and wanted that independence like the rest of Serbia. And this is where that tension really plays a big role in the spark that's kind of explodes in this powder keg of Europe. Another cause of World War I, of course, is imperialism. For a long time, in fact, for centuries, European nations have been building empires all around the world. Of course, imperialism, as you remember from last chapter, is extending a powerful nation's economic and political control over various peoples and smaller nations. And there was reason for this. And you just have to think of England, that little island. It supplied England and other powers like them with raw materials to kind of fuel their industrial might, their industrial revolutions that they were having in their countries. That's why Germany will get involved in this too. It's another reason why France did. And of course, the other thing is, and if you think of the American colonies, it provided markets for England's manufactured goods. So it provided markets for manufactured goods. So a lot of countries liked this idea of imperialism. They liked going after these little countries because it was money. It was power. But there's a cost to imperialism, as we talked about last chapter. And again, a special note at the bottom here too, as Germany industrialized, they began to compete with France and England for colonies around the world. In fact, wars almost broke out in areas of like Africa and even China. The open door notes kind of brings that point in there too. But again, this also challenged these countries to increase what the next point will be, militarism. And it's going to challenge, Germany's going to challenge England in naval supremacy. And of course, yeah, England doesn't like this. And part of that naval supremacy for Germany, if you look at the picture on the right, were their U-boats, those submarines. It was their one kind of secret way of trying to get around England's extensive hold on shipping lanes and sea lanes on all the oceans. And so another cause, of course, is obviously militarism. If you go after these empires, these other little nations to exert your economic and political control, that's expensive. And it also causes you to build up a military so that you can defend them. And so it's the development of armed forces. Militarism is that development of armed forces. It is very expensive. And as that competition increased among nations around the world, nations wanted larger armies than their enemies, so that nobody kind of bothered them. And also they could, probably maybe take over other countries too. And just keep in mind that by 1890, Germany was one of the strongest nations industrially. In fact, not only industrially, but they were one of the strongest nations military-wise as well. Their army was huge. Great Britain still had the largest and strongest navy in the world, but Germany was already starting to prepare for what they figured had to come sooner than later, and that was war. Not so much against Britain, though. Interestingly, it's more aimed at their neighbors to the east, and that's Russia. And again, another that final cause. Remember, we're talking 4 real causes here. Is the alliance system, and the alliance system is a system of treaties to protect oneself from these enemies. And a way to think about treaties is to think about them all from one country to another country, tying themselves with a rope to each other. And when war breaks out in Europe here for World War I, it's as if they all tug on those ropes, and it brings everybody into this war. In 1914, you really had 2 major alliances that were formed in Europe. One was known very early on as the Triple Entente. Later, we would refer to them as the Allied forces. It initially begins with France, Russia, and Great Britain. Later, Japan and Italy will join that, but not right away. The other was known as the Triple Alliance. Later, that one becomes known as the Central Powers. If you look on the map, Germany, Austria, Hungary, Italy, they're kind of in the center of Europe between Russia and France. Makes sense, doesn't it? And later, Turkey will join that, and Bulgaria will also join that. Bulgaria was kind of part of that old Ottoman Empire. Well, let's look at the diplomatic crisis that really kind of sparks the war here. That spark flared in what we call the Balkan Peninsula, which was sometimes, and you maybe heard of this phrase from world history, was known as the powder keg of Europe. In addition to all of the ethnic rivalries among those Balkan peoples, Europe's leading powers had tremendous interest in those countries, mostly for natural resources, like coal would be a big one. Russia also needed access to the Mediterranean Sea, and so the Balkans provided that opportunity for them to get there. It all kind of comes crashing down then around June of 1914. What happens in June of 1914 is the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who's actually the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, decides to head to Sarajevo, which was part of that Serbian people that wanted their independence from Austria-Hungary. And so there was kind of a, you might say, a terrorist group that is in Serbia there around Sarajevo that really is kind of looking for opportunity to kind of get that independence. And part of that, you might say, terrorist group was a young man. He's about 17 years old, Gavrilo Princip. And if you talk about Murphy's Law, if anything could go wrong, it really kind of went wrong here for Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophia. One, they ended up going after crossing a bridge. They realized they're on a wrong street, and he orders his driver to go in reverse and get out of there. And there happened to be right next to a cafe where a frustrated Gavrilo Princip is sitting, figuring that he, blew his chance. He didn't have, he lost his chance of trying to get, assassinate the Archduke. The only problem is, as the driver put his vehicle, in reverse, it caused the car to stall. And this gave Gavrilo Princip his opportunity. Interestingly, the guy that was supposed to protect the Archduke here was on the other side of the car by Sophie, not by him. If you look at the picture, it's a sketch. Gavrilo is actually down on the bottom right-hand side of the picture. And again, he's 17 years old. He's a young kid. And interestingly, it's the only reason he's not going to get the death sentence is because he's only 17 years old. And he'll die about 4 years later in prison. He wasn't intending to actually kill Sophie. At least the plot was not to do that. But he ends up killing both of them. He's apprehended almost immediately. And there are actual pictures of his apprehension. I just didn't put them up there. And so this is kind of like, you might say, the first pull of the ropes in Europe. And so Austria-Hungary is going to give Serbia an ultimatum here. In other words, they have to meet these requirements or else. And behind Austria-Hungary's ultimatum, don't miss this, is Germany, Berlin. Kaiser Wilhelm and his guys are all behind this because, as I mentioned earlier, Germany's looking for a war, and mostly against Russia. All right, so parts of this ultimatum, Serbia needs to end their agitation against Austria-Hungary. They need to punish all those involved in the murder plot and allow Austria-Hungary to help in that investigation. There are other things too. These are some of the major ones. One of the things that Serbia doesn't like here is the fact that they would actually end up or be giving up parts of their independence. I'll mention that a little bit later. And so again, this crisis that sparked war, Serbia will agree to some, but not all of them. And again, part of it is they would have had to give up their independence, and they didn't want to do that. That was the part of Serbia that was independent, not Sarajevo part. And so Austria will end up declaring war pretty much at the push of Germany in July 28th of 1914. And we start to see the strings pulled in Europe here. Of course, Germany gives them the okay to stand firm on that. Russia finds out about this and really tells Austria-Hungary, hey, kind of lay off a little bit, ease up on those demands, especially with regards to independence. Germany pretty much instructs Austria to not do that. And as a result, Russia will mobilize for war. The only problem is Russia is going to have a difficult time. If you look at the picture on the bottom right, that's actually railroad cars filled with Russian soldiers that were working to mobilize. This is going to take Russia a long time, and Germany knows that. Germany knows that. They have a long way to go to get to what they would refer to as the Eastern Front. But because Germany starts to mobilize for war, Germany declares war on Russia. Russia pulls its string with France, their ally. France gives Russia the okay and pretty much tell them they're in. Germany tells France they better stay out. The reason for that was Germany was hoping to just keep this a one-front war, realizing if you look at the map, Germany's got France on one side, Russia on the other. France says no, and so Germany will declare war on France. And this kind of draws all of these countries in Europe in. Notice we haven't mentioned Great Britain yet. We'll talk about that next time.